Listen. This is how the story begins. There was once an old castle that stood in the middle of a deep and gloomy wood. It was built of black stone, and its walls were damp and covered in moss, and in the castle lived an old fairy. Now this fairy could take any shape she fancied. All day long she flew about in the form of an owl, or crept about the country like a cat, but at night she always became an old woman again. When any young man came within 100 paces of her castle, he became quite fixed and couldn't move a step until she came and set him free, which she wouldn't do until he promised never to come back again. But when any pretty girl came within that space, she was changed into a bird, and the fairy put her into a cage and hung her up in a chamber in the castle. There was great tragedy in this chamber, and 7,000 of these cages hung there, and all with beautiful birds in them. Now then, there was once a girl whose name was Jorinda. She was prettier than all the pretty girls that were ever seen before, and a shepherd lad whose name was Jorindel was very fond of her, and they were soon to be married. One day they went to walk in the wood so they could be alone, and Jorindel said, "We must watch out we don't go too near to the fairy's castle." It was a beautiful evening. The last rays of the setting sun shone bright through the long stems of the trees on the green underwood beneath, and turtle doves sang from the tall birches. Jorinda sat down to feel the last of the sun on her face. Jorindel sat by her side, and both felt sad, and they didn't know why, but it felt as though they were to be parted from one another forever. They'd wandered a long way, and when they looked to see which way they should go home, they found themselves at a loss to know which path to take. The sun was setting fast by now, and already half of its circle had sunk behind the hill. Jorindel, on an impulse, looked behind him and saw through the bushes that they had, without noticing, sat down close under the walls of the old castle. He jumped up for fear, went as white as a sheet, and trembled. Jorinda, who hadn't noticed, was just singing. The ringdove sang from the willow spray, "Sorrow, sorrow, sorrow, he'll mourn for the fate of his darling mate. Tomorrow, tomorrow." Her song stopped suddenly. Jorindel turned to see why, and in that moment saw his Jorinda changed into a nightingale, so that her song ended with a mournful "Jump, jump." An owl with fiery eyes flew 3 times round them, and 3 times screamed, "To-woo! To-woo! To-woo!" Jorindel couldn't move. He stood fixed as stone, could neither weep, nor speak, nor move hand or foot. And now the sun went all the way down. The gloomy night came, and the owl flew into a bush. And a moment after, the old fairy came out, pale and thin, with staring eyes, and a nose and chin that almost met one another. She mumbled something to herself, seized the nightingale in a wicker cage, and went away with it in her hand. Poor Jorindel saw the nightingale was gone, but what could he do? He couldn't speak, and he couldn't move from the spot where he stood. At last the fairy came back and sang with a hoarse voice, "Till the prisoner's fast, and her fate is cast, there stay, oh stay. When the charm's around her, and the spell has bound her, run away, away!" all of a sudden, Jorindel found himself free. He fell on his knees before the fairy and prayed her to give him back his dear Jorinda, but she just laughed at him and said he should never see her again. And then she went away. He prayed, he wept, he moaned, all in vain. "Oh no," he said, "what'll become of me?" He couldn't go back to his own home. So he went to a strange village and employed himself in keeping sheep. Many a time he walked round and round, as near to the hated castle as he dared to go. All in vain. He neither heard nor saw anything of Jorinda. At last, one night he dreamt that he'd found a beautiful purple flower, and that in the middle of it lay a costly pearl. And he dreamt that he picked the flower and went with it in his hand to the castle, and that everything he touched with it was disenchanted, and that there he found his Jorinda again. The dream was vivid and urgent, and in the morning when he woke, he was determined to act on it. 8 days he searched over hill and dale for this pretty flower with no luck. But on the 9th day, early in the morning, he found the beautiful purple flower, and in the middle of it was a large dewdrop as big as a costly pearl. Then he plucked the flower and set out and travelled day and night without rest till he came again to the castle. He walked up to the invisible boundary 100 paces away, and when he crossed, he didn't become fixed as before, but found that he could go quite close up to the door. Jorindel was greatly encouraged by this. Then he touched the door with a flower, and it sprang open, so that he went in through the court and listened. He heard so many birds singing. At last, he came to the chamber where the fairy sat, with the 7,000 birds singing in the 7,000 cages. When she saw Jorindel, she was fuming, really angry, and screamed with rage, but she couldn't come within 2 paces of him, for the flower he held in his hand was like a shield. He looked around at the birds, but alas, there were many, many nightingales, and how was he to know which one was Jorinda? While he was thinking what to do, he saw the fairy had taken down one of the cages and was doing her best to sneak out through the door. He flew after her, touched the cage with the flower and the fairy, and in an instant, Jorinda stood before him. She threw her arms round his neck. She was as beautiful as ever, as beautiful as when they'd walked together in the wood. The fairy was robbed of her power. She shrieked and ran from the chamber. And then he touched all the other birds with the flower, so that they all took their old forms again. And he took Jorinda home, and they were married, and lived happily together for many years. And so did a good many other lads, whose partners had been forced to sing in the old fairies' cages.